Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a hopefully short Ukraine War Update extra video, giving you the extra nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of this war. And I'm just going to really deal with a couple of things because I've got such a backlog of content I want to talk about because I basically want to talk about everything, right? And if I don't clear some of it, I ain't never going to get a chance. So today's starting point is the Russian propagandist that Julia Davis, who's a journalist, for the Daily Beast, I believe, but she's the one that does the translations of all these propagandists when they appear on TV to splurge their outright nonsense in many cases. But she's written this piece for the CEPA on how gloom has enveloped Putin's TV propagandists. Just to let you know who the CEPA are, we'll give you a bit of they are this, who are they, about, there we go, about CEPA. So CEPA are the Center for European Policy Analysis, a non-profit, non-partisan public policy institution based in Washington, D.C., focused on strengthening the transatlantic alliance through cutting-edge research, analysis, and programs. So that's who they are. Let's now go and see what she has to say. So I just picked out a few parts here. So appearing on the evening with Vladimir Solovyov. So Solovyov is this chap who you've seen an awful lot of. He's a rabid propagandist. On February the 28th, 2023, movie director Karen Shaka-Nazarov noted, quote, "The situation brings us a danger of very heavy consequences if we lose. We have to consider the possibility of losing. I disagree with those who say, no need to consider that, we will win. I don't know about that." Solovyov, who once read out lists of the many Western publications mentioning his nuclear threats, suddenly changed his tune on March the 6th. So he would usually have fought back against this and been very much full of bravado and how Russia are just indestructible, that kind of stuff. But for the first time in months, discussions about the potential course of Vladimir Putin's war steered clear of bombastic predictions that London or Washington would soon be wiped off the face of the earth. Solovyov's tone was dark, prompting his guests to hang their heads. He asked, can our army in its current state, with its current numbers of people and with our military-industrial complex, fulfill its goals? Which are not about the war against Ukraine, which does not exist, but against NATO. Okay, there's quite a lot just on picking that quote. Because A, he's still saying Ukraine doesn't exist. So there's this idea of, and I talked to you about this, a very early video of mine I did, talking about essentialism, and it's a philosophical position that is just, in my opinion, completely untenable, that there's some objective reality of ideas such as Ukraine that exists out there that means you can be right or wrong. And so if you claim that you are Ukrainian, you have Ukrainian culture and language, and that these are the borders that are on a map, and that I live in Ukraine, I'm Ukrainian, this is us, that is somehow wrong. That is objectively false that Ukraine exists, and you are just basically lying, you're fooling yourself, there is no such thing as Ukraine. And I would see this as a form of essentialism. And I've talked to you many times before about how ideas don't exist in our heads, and when we agree on them, we write dictionaries and encyclopedias and we write laws together, but they can be changed. There are no inalienable rights, right? So the Constitution in America, I know pro-constitutionalists will be like, oh, it's more sacred than the Bible. It's not. It's a piece of paper that people agreed on, and you can change it. Hence, you have amendments, right? It's like, oh, we forgot to say that. Oh, that wasn't very good. It turns out that we're all still pro-slavery, so we're going to have to maybe tinker with that a little bit. And so it gets changed because it's just a bunch of ideas that people have got together and agreed upon, and you can change it. And in fact, I don't know the exact way that you can do it, but you probably need super majorities in Congress. You can still change it, right? It can get changed. So these things don't exist out there as objective, like, ideals or objective truths. They exist in here, and we just agree on them, and then we codify them into law. And they're only meaningful when we codify these things into law, and that law is defended and enacted and enforced by law enforcement, judiciaries, etc., etc., etc. So when it comes to people saying Ukraine don't exist, it might not exist in their heads, but if a bunch of other people, for example, people living in Ukraine, say, hey, it exists and we live here and we've got our own culture and language because we're using it and we're telling you we do, then the Russians don't get to deny that, or they can deny that, but they've got no rational basis for that other than what's going on in their heads. And it's the world is about consensus and agreement, right? So if the Ukrainians agree that Ukraine exists and the rest of the world agrees that Ukraine exists, then Russia saying it doesn't exist, it doesn't really cut the mustard because no one else agrees with that. So if they go and attack Ukraine and say it doesn't matter, it doesn't exist, like if the rest of the world don't agree and say that's illegal, then I'm sorry, but that's illegal because the rest of the world get to say that. There is no objective truth to it existing or not existing. These things are agreements amongst humanity, and I'm sorry if you are being aggressive and oppressive and going against the moral diktats of the rest of the world, or at least most of the rest of the world, and the EU and the neighbours of Ukraine, then you're going to get into trouble. So then it becomes this whole thing because Ukraine, according to Solovyov here, doesn't exist, but NATO does exist. I don't know how he gets to say that. One bunch of people who say they're in an identifiable group or situation can self-proclaim their existence, but another group of people who are in a like situation and proclaim their existence don't exist. It's just complete double standards. NATO exists, but Ukraine doesn't because it just fits our narrative, right? But anyway, I digress. So your man here says NATO, they are fighting against NATO, and this is, I think, starting to lay out the narrative now, or like putting it out there that, do you know what, if we lose, if things go south, it's not because we got beaten by Ukraine because they don't exist, it's because we got beaten by NATO. And this is now Russia against NATO, and they're starting to put out ideas, put feelers out so that people are used to the idea that they might lose, but if they do lose, it's NATO. And that evil NATO, and we are just poor little Russia. We're great and we're amazing, but we're against lots of other people who are all evil and they're all against us. And there we go. So then someone else who was being sort of overly positive recently, then Solovyov came back and said, seriously, how are they going to attain this victory? As in Russia, how are our Russian troops going to attain this victory? State Duma Deputy Andrei Gurylyov, a former deputy commander of Russia's southern military district, replied to Solovyov's questions and grimly surmised, all of us understand that very well that we are fighting against NATO. We've discussed it on many occasions. I am asked, can we defeat NATO? If you use math and calculate the correlation of forces and means, in the best case scenario, we can merely defend ourselves. He says, after attacking another country, we can merely defend ourselves in attacking another country. Yeah, but at least there's some kind of creeping realism here. Now, it's hard to be sure, says Julia Davis, it's hard to be sure how much of the tone change is attributable directly to the talk show's Kremlin masters, but we do know that senior media staff receive directions on coverage from the regime, and these guides are sometimes cut and pasted into media articles. The Kremlin guides also suggest content as in March of 2022, when media were told it was essential to quote the Fox News host and Ukraine war skeptic Tucker Carlson. We also know that Russia has suffered at least 200,000 casualties, and that as a result, ordinary Russians are aware that the conflict is proving extremely difficult at best. Reality denial is getting harder. This is a really important point. So at some point, the chicken comes home to roost, right? So at some point, reality, you can't deny reality. So when your friends' children have been killed, when your own child has been killed, when all these people around have someone connected to their family who have died or has been injured in this war, you kind of join the dots together and think, maybe the war's not going so well. And when the war, after a year, and it was supposed to be a 3-day military operation, special military operation, is still going on, and you're hearing about NATO being involved and allies, you're thinking this probably isn't going as well as we're being led to believe, then reality does bite. It gets harder to deny reality. Anyway, she goes on. It's an interesting article, but there's definitely this this change that's been evident in some of the propagandists recently that I think reflects the inevitability of reality. You can lie for only so long before people can see through your lies, and when it doesn't match up with reality, you get found out. Which goes back to the kind of talk about the Ukrainian like losses and this and that. If they lie, if they overtly lie over and over again, day in, day out, about the losses that Russia are sustaining, about what's happening on the front lines, and eventually no one will believe them, and there'll be such a disconnect from reality that their words is worth nothing and it becomes counterproductive. So it's not in Ukraine's best interest to lie. It's in Russia's best interest in certain contexts to lie because they are controlling a population who are a closed population who, at least according to the intentions of the Kremlin, don't have access to information outside of their bubble, VPNs and whatnot aside, right? So they can lie to their population. They have been lying to their population for a very long time, and it does work for them. But out in the freer world where we have open source intelligence that's throwing things out left, right, and center, and you've got video footage and this and that we've got all access to seeing, even if some of the Russians don't, then things become more difficult. And lying isn't such an easy sort of pastime. It doesn't get the results you might hope it does. Anyway, yeah, a change in narrative. I don't know if it's narrative, just a change in outlook, I guess, for some of these propagandists. Right, I've talked to you about this brilliant podcast before. I'm going to play you the very end of it. This is Michael Kaufman, who is very knowledgeable on all things sort of Russian and to do with the war, particularly. Shashank Joshi, the Economist defense correspondent or editor, whatnot. He's singing the praises of this, did a summary of it on his thread. But I'm just going to play you the end here where Kaufman talks about, so he's just been to Bakhmut, and this is about his observations of the front line of what's been happening, talking to a bunch of people. Really fascinating. I've got a whole list of things which I'll share with you. I've already shared with you once, but I'll share with you again. But just let's listen to how he's going to wrap it up.
Any other key insights, Mike, before we wrap up that you think the listeners should hear about?
Look, I'd say that in general, looking at the war effort, I came back in many ways having some of my earlier views validated on a couple of big issues. First is that priority for Ukraine are artillery and air defense ammunition. Everybody there agrees as well, which is heartening to hear, right? Because sometimes you're 1,000 miles away and you have one depiction, one sense of what's going on. And then you go there and you obviously hope that you're not going to show up there. People tell you, hey, you got it all wrong. Actually, the list is completely different, or it's in reverse order from what you've been saying. So that was good to hear. After that, definitely the issue is force quality. And it's been an issue for some time, and what to do about force quality and dealing with the fact that a lot of that force is mobilized, right? And I think force reconstitution, I've spoken about that for the past year, but it's really coming to the fore as a problem. Next, armored fighting vehicles. We talk about them a lot. It's all a quantity numbers game. If you look at the size of the corps Ukrainians are trying to build, Dmitry, it's a lot of mechanized infantry and tank brigades in each one. That's just a lot of armored fighting vehicles. It almost doesn't matter what they are, to be perfectly honest. Like, Ukrainian units, brigades they have now, have been dramatically expanded. Some of them feature 7 infantry battalions per brigade, okay? There is no mechanization for them. There isn't actually a lot in the way of military motorization for them either. So this military needs mobility to go on the offensive. It can hold defense all day long, right? A 7 battalion infantry brigade can hold Bakhmut, can hold Vuhledar, don't get me wrong, and hold Marinka. But if you want that military to go on a major offensive in the south, it needs to be driving on something. So that's basically, I came away from it looking at the size of the units going, dear God, that is a lot of infantry battalions, not on mobility, and also needs the logistics to do it, and also needs breaching equipment as well. There are capability gaps because you see how bad Russians look at Vuhledar driving to the same minefield every morning? Okay, well, Zaporizhia looks like that. Like, Russians have probably mined Zaporizhia as best they can. So if you don't have breaching assault equipment, that relative to your force, that's going to be a challenge. There's capability gaps there.
So I was trying to look up force quality there to see if there's anything meaningful to put onto that more than what you and I would know of that. But he's talked, and he talks earlier in the podcast about like problems with reconstituting forces and with the expertise that's been lost over the course of a year. So some of the most experienced fighters have been lost, dead or casualties, wounded, and not getting back onto the front line. So what you're doing is you're then replacing those experienced, really good troops with mobilized troops who have had a tiny bit of training, or you're sending people to the UK, to Poland, to Germany or whatever. They're getting a bit of training, but they're coming back and they're not. Yeah, it's great to have that training, and they are getting better training than the Russians. But are these guys as good as the people they are replacing? Arguably not. And so the overall force quality isn't there, although that is an issue for the Russians completely as well. In fact, arguably far more so. But if you're just looking from the Ukrainian point of view, it's suboptimal. It's not as good as it could be because, of course, you're in the middle of a war, right? But he's saying, like, that is an issue. Reconstitution's an issue. And then mechanization. But, of course, he's looking at these predominantly infantry brigades. Now, there is a load of mechanization coming. I mean, there's different figures, but it could be as many as 1,000 vehicles. Of all sorts of types, MRAPs, APCs, IFVs, tanks of different types, MBTs, modern decent tanks, as well as down to, upscaled older tanks, etc., etc. There should be a whole bunch to throw into here, but I'm so pleased he's talked, because this is my big worry that I've been saying for some days now, is that I'm worried about how many mines there'll be for Ukraine to fight through in a counteroffensive. If they're particularly down south, if one of the options is to go down south to past Melitopol, to Mariupol, to Tokmat, I don't know, any of these places, Berdyansk, to the coast, they're going to have to go through absolute whole swathes and fields of mines, as well as trenches and all this stuff. And if they don't have enough of that equipment, it's no good having the odd, anti-mine, demining bit of kit here and there, or the odd bit of bridging equipment. They need a ton of this stuff, as well as all the previously mentioned equipment, in order to have a successful counter. Because if these mine plow vehicles are turning up and then getting hit because they're at the vanguard or whatever, necessarily because they don't want anyone else to drive into these things, then they're going to probably get through a number of these vehicles. It's one thing asking for battalions of main battle tanks, but if you don't have battalions of mine clearing vehicles, you're going to be in trouble.
That's all I'll say on that front. Yeah, beyond that, in many ways, I think it helped me validate my own views on some of the big issues that I thought were the driving problems or concerns for the Ukrainian military. Some other ones, like I said, I learned about military culture issues, the things that happen when you lose a part of your force or a trained part of your force, then other folks come in from reserve, and you have these sort of interactions also between junior mobilized or NCOs and higher level staff officers or reserve officers that have come in.
What was the attitude of the troops at the front towards the West? You hear a lot of criticisms from Kiev that they're not getting enough support or it's not coming fast enough. Did you hear some of the same sentiment on the front lines, or was it different?
No, I honestly, listen, I personally don't hear it on the front lines. The main thing you hear on the front lines is Ukrainian military, like any large force in a big war, has internal distribution problems. Okay? So a lot of their gripes have to do with their own logistics. It's not about what we give things enter Ukraine, but then all Ukrainian units have to find their way to getting those things. And there's a lot of challenges in that. And anyone who's ever seen a military operation, the best military operation with U.S. logistics, will see those issues, okay, where one unit has one thing, another one doesn't. The supply base has things that are completely random in the name, but you can't get night vision goggles or you can't get these other things. And you're like, who has them?
And this possibly talks to the idea that certain units right back in the west of Ukraine, nearest to the supply as it comes into the country, have some of the best gear. And like the people on the front don't, because as it gets closer to the front, people take their pick, and it kind of filters out. And then by the time it gets, the people that actually need it the most are often the less well equipped. This is a huge problem for the Russians, particularly at the beginning of the war, and there were lots of accounts of how Russian people just ransacked supply trucks as they were coming through, so that eventually when they got to the front line, like the front line people had the worst stuff, and then some of the people further back who had taken all the good stuff then was selling it to the front line troops for a profit. It's like, what? But this is an issue for, as he says, for every army has these issues in a conflict like this.
And then you have to find somebody who has the hookup, and maybe you have to trade something to them for it, and so on and so on. This is very common. But some internal distribution, definitely big issues there. Most of their gripes are internal. It's not, hey, the U.S. isn't giving us enough things. It's much more of how do I get access to the things that supposedly we've been given. And also just a lot of people looking to kit up, to be perfectly honest. There's never enough kit. It's a large force. It's a growing force, and there's just never enough equipment for them. So they're all trying to kit up as best they can. I didn't hear any complaints really about specific things we've been providing or not providing. I know what Ukrainian asks are at big picture, big level, sort of higher level, but they're very frank and public about them. It's not like they're trying to hide the fact that they need more artillery ammunition or more air defense capabilities and what have you. So that part's pretty easy. Yeah.
Last question, and again, we've talked a lot in the past about Starlink and its importance. Is it still important to the troops in Ukraine? Are they using now other mechanisms? Are they going back to Viasat terminals, or is it still Starlink all the time?
It's all about Starlink. I would just say that. I hate the idea of game changers or anything like that, but if you're looking for one enabling technology that's critical to the war effort, it is Starlink. That's it. I see it everywhere. It's essential. Everybody has it. Everybody has a terminal, an antenna. So I shudder to think what the war effort would look like without Starlink, just being honest.
And we often talk about sort of the military applications of Starlink, using it for ISR, artillery correction, but you were telling me a story when you were in Bakhmut that troops were even watching a movie, right, during the break. So even having access to the internet for sort of downtime can help with morale.
Really interesting. So singing the praises of Starlink, saying it is absolutely integral to the Ukrainian war efforts. Super important. So when they had it taken away for a little bit in Kherson, when they've had issues at certain times, whether that was intentional or not, with spats with Elon Musk, these things hurt, because actually Starlink is that core to their war effort. Fascinating. Anyway, go and check that out. It really is worth watching. Okay, on that level, here's Mick Ryan, the retired Australian general, says, good to see sappers leading the way as usual. So sappers engineering. This is Brigadier Michael Say saying 2CE are making the most of training at Shoalwater Bay as they undertake bridging operations to enable mobility within the combined arms team. This is super important. Here is Brigadier Michael Say, Australian commander of the 7th Brigade in Brisbane, Australia. This is all so important for doing war, right? For being on the front line, and the hope is that Ukraine are getting training that looks like this. And I have seen in the UK like examples of combined arms stuff going on, and there's talk that in Grafenwohr, like in Germany, this is what they're being trained on at the moment, is doing combined arms, which is going to be engineering to do linking up with your infantry, your artillery, your mechanization, your logistics, etc. So important. Anyway, finally for this video, this is Dario Massico. How long have I been going? 25 minutes already. Jeez. who is a senior policy researcher for RAND Corporation, focusing on defense issues in Russia. This is concerning the recent missile attack, the way that there was the longest gap between missile attacks since the beginning of October, and you had a really interesting variation of missiles that were used by the Russians, and lots of people are theorizing that this is indicating they're running out of certain missiles, and so on and so forth. So she says, I've been comparing Russian missile strikes against Ukraine over the last few months with what is known as about their doctrine and launch capacity. I'd like to share a little about recent trends below. Before I do, there are Ukrainian civilians who are suffering and dying from these strikes. I've said it before, Ukraine needs sustained air defense systems and interceptor missiles and other support, as there is an effort underway to exhaust Ukrainian SAMs over time, SAM surface-to-air missiles. I haven't made my way through all the strikes since 2022, so far just 2023 today. So this is based on data from 2023 alone. I've compiled launch points where known, missile type, and interception rate. Sources for now are UAF, so it's Ukrainian sources, and Western media. I will catalogue Russian info next. Speaking of interception rates, she points to someone who's got great information, and you should subscribe to them, Comrade Muzerka. The attack this week, 81 missiles, some saying 95 now, was not the largest in 2023. The largest was 1 month ago with 105 in total. And of course, that's far less than it's been previously fired at Ukraine back last year. This attack was different in terms of type of systems used, launch locations, variation of launches, and missile trajectories, making it complex to defend against. It features 6 Kinzhal hypersonic, and I've talked to you about these Kinzhal missiles, ALBMs, that means air-launched ballistic missiles, if I remember correctly, which means that these are launched from the air, from aircraft. So MiG-31s launching these, and they are ballistic missiles, so they'll go up into the stratosphere and then come down super fast, so fast that really air defense can't do much about it, and they come down very cute. It's just very difficult to defend against these. The largest salvo so far in the war, and the largest recorded for combat use of this missile. Russia doesn't have large numbers of this system, rumored in the dozens. More on that. Ukrainian officials say they cannot intercept Kinzhal, KH-22 ASCMs, those anti-ship cruise missiles. So some of these missiles are designed and act in different ways depending on what their platform to be launched from is supposed to be and what their target is supposed to be. So for KH-22, they're supposed to be, or designed to be, used against ships. I get that may result in them being less. I know some anti-ship missiles have been used and they're less accurate on land because they're not so good at weaving around urban areas. They're used to just being fired out at sea, very flat. You find your ship, you hit the ship. So trying to find your target in a landscape, urban environment becomes very difficult, and so they're more inaccurate. The question is why they're using those, and then it gets back to, well, it's because they're running out of the stuff they should be using. Anyway, but these are quite difficult to take down. So another answer to why they're using these is because they're difficult to shoot down. So anyway, Kinzhal, KH-22 ASCMs, and S-300. So those are surface-to-air missiles. You're supposed to be designed to be shot at aircraft and air targets, but actually can be used in a ground-to-ground way, and they are very hard to shoot down, but also quite inaccurate used in that way. Air defense missiles repurposed for land attacks. Too fast, trajectory is difficult. They claim Russia has fired 210 KH-22 since 2022, and here you go. None of them intercepted. So if these are inaccurate, fired on land, okay, but if you're firing 210 of them, like if only 50% of them hit their targets, well, that's better than sending off a load that just gets shot down and like 20% hit their targets. Now you've got an advantage here. So yep, they're more inaccurate, but they can't be shot down. So it's just weighing up the pros and cons of these different missiles, and by firing a whole range of them, of course, they're trying to work out exactly what the best things to shoot are. Or indeed all of them, and then the air defense system is both overwhelmed and trying to deal with all these different types of missiles and trajectories and so on and so forth. KH-22 AS-4 Soviet-era ASCM anti-ship cruise missile was designed to be an aircraft carrier killer. It's not very precise, but it is supersonic, so it goes faster than the speed of sound. So it's pretty fast for a cruise missile. They're not as fast as ballistic missiles. from the info that I have, there is no set pattern to the makeup of the strike packages this year. Many are ASCMs, anti-ship cruise missiles, or SAM, surface-to-air missiles, purpose for land attack roles. A few reasons for this in no particular order: experimentation to see what works, stockpile issues, launcher readiness. Note, no SS-26, SSC-7 in quite some time, probably as inventory is low. They are using different combinations of balloons, Shaheeds, timing waves of missiles, shifting launch locations, and so on to reduce interception rates. Right, balloons. And I haven't talked about balloons yet, but there was a time, and I presume this is still happening, around about the time actually the balloons over America, Chinese balloons. Russia was sending over a bunch of balloons, and they have these reflective stuffs on the bottom that it's kind of like a star shape, like reflective star prism, if you like. And that bounces off radar. In other words, they're there to attract radar. They're there to be found, and then surface-to-air missiles shoot at them. And then A, you know where the surface-to-air missiles are, you know where they're launching from, and B, they're using up those missiles on a balloon type thing. So these are all their confusing signals, because you're sending over missiles and you've got balloons and you've got all sorts of stuff going on. So that's how I understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong. So they're doing all these things, as she says, not depicted in the chart. Each strike originates from slightly different locations. They haven't launched much from Belarus in the last month, according to Ukrainian officials. It's a mix from Belgorod, Caspian and Black Sea, Rostov, Kursk, and occupied Zaporizhia. So all around kind of the south and east, really, and Belgorod as well. So just to the north by Kharkiv. So not really from the northwest over Belarus way. While the Russians likely know the limitations and strengths of Ukraine's Soviet-Russian origin SAMs, they are likely trying to probe weaknesses in NASAMS or IRIS-T performance. Back in November, NASAMS had a 100% success rate, according to Secretary of Defense Austin. As for overall targets, most of these strikes are continuing to target the power grid or an oil refinery, defense industrial targets, what is called critical infrastructure in Russian military strategy. However, missiles are striking residential buildings. Ukraine is repairing their grid. The strikes are lethal, yet they backfire too, as Ukrainians are more resolved against Russia with each wave. Nor do I see how they directly support the Donbass effort. So one of the overriding reasons for Putin to be conducting this war effort is to defend Donbass. It's to denazify, defend Donbass. You go down the list of the things that he's intending to do to protect Donbass with the war effort, and then none of those match with sending missiles into Lviv to hit the energy infrastructure. In other words, Putin is talking shite, right? And he's lying, and it's BS, and he's a war criminal. In no particular order. Just the realization of what they're doing with the missile strategy is as clear indication that this is an attempt to just destroy Ukraine, and not all those like pathetic excuses for the war that he had to come out with later after the special military operation went tits up. So just like it's Putin. Anyway, I digress. Let's continue. That being said, I do worry that this wears down Ukrainian SAM inventory. Yep. I don't know how many interceptors they expend for each Russian missile launched. Is Russia following their CONOPS or PGMs? Yes and no. On one hand, there is an adherence to striking critical infrastructure, so their kind of doctrine. But on the other hand, they have not found lasting effects from this approach and haven't switched to a fundamentally different strategy. If interested, we have a new report on the subject. We discuss aspects of Russian PGM targeting and launch capacity by platform. It was written in 2021, pre-war, but only recently approved for public release. So that's from her. As we noted then, but we are unable to discuss here until approved, there was a large gap between their theory and the force to achieve its effect with PGMs, EW, electronic warfare, and counter space capabilities. So anyway, she's talking about that. Final thought. Russia is facing PGM inventory issues and is experimenting with what it has left. These attacks strain Ukrainian air defenses, and this is a problem over time. The attacks come every few weeks. Thanks for reading. The end. So she's talking about PGM inventory issues here. So precision-guided munition inventory issues. In other words, Russia is facing a stockpile issue. They are running out or running low or using at unsustainable rates precision-guided munitions, cruise missiles, particularly. They have a lot of S-300 surface-to-air missiles, and I think that is why you're going to see a greater weighting of those sorts of missiles in future missile attacks. Not only because they have loads of them, but also the Ukrainians struggle to shoot them down as well. Yes, they are inaccurate and not the greatest missile to be using for the job that they are intending them for, but they've got loads of them, so why not use them? Something like 8,000 at the last count they had remaining. They do use them consistently throughout the weeks. It's not just these saturation missile attacks. Zaporizhia gets hit very often, and Kharkiv gets hit by S-300s on a regular basis. So these are used very often for surface to surface targeting. Anyway, that's another extra. That's an extra. I'm going to throw this out, I think, late tonight, just for laughs and giggles and whatnot, stuff and giggles. Anyway, appreciate all your support. Thank you again. Thank you so much to the new members of the clan, the channel. Really appreciate them coming on board. Thanks so much to new ones: Sean Lindsay, Smith, RNH Endersby, who's come over from my other channel, Mark Raven, Peter, Brian Warren, who's a deep geopol thinker, as well as Leah Kroll, legends, Von Dalen. I really do appreciate everyone. Brian Ivy, Matt Larson, awesome, Chris P, Simon Martin, InQ. These are deep thinkers as well. Brian Ivy and Matt Larson, and Da Vinci, Hans Bodemans, Robert Kierstad, Bill Nicodemus, Tom NPS, Sabra Bursevicht, Mikey Bump, Sabra, of course, and Han and Da Vinci, as I said, deep thinkers. Mikey Bump, Imre Hadju, Subhero, Robespierre, Scott Milan, Elim Tavir, Andres Erdovics, James Cottle, Mark Schwarman, Hans-Peter Nielsen, Tyler Crockett, John Lloyd, Memos, Mitch Mazarol, Kevin Alexander, Yanonis Kiliorus, and Ian Ratner. Some of those have been several months long in the tooth now here, so I really appreciate all your support. Thank you. Please take care, and I will speak to you soon.